right,
are likely to be accelerated and hastened. So I think the thinker who got this time correctly, interestingly, in retrospect, was Fareed Zakaria, who talked about illiberal democracy and a post-American world. And the world that's coming out of the pandemic looks like that. It's basically a world of disaggregated power. There's no global leadership. The U.S. not particularly in charge, and everybody fighting with everybody else, and nobody
right,
particularly being constructive and democratic. So it's not a pleasant picture where we are coming out of this. Instead of bringing people together,
right.
it seems to be dividing countries and people.
The essay on China in your new issue, Gideon, is absolutely stunning on the grimness of President Xi and the control or lack of control he has over the future of China. Expand on that with the resources you have on China.
So Ming-Shin Pei, the author of this piece, is a wonderful scholar, one of the America's great and the world's great China experts. And he makes the case that China, looked at objectively right now, and Xi Jinping's China is sort of at the end of a long boom, at the end of a political success story, and it's going to be very hard for them to keep going forward on the same kind of track economically over the next several years, the argument is, and that if the economy doesn't keep moving forward, then the regime might prove much more brittle than people think, because a lot of it has been driven by performance legitimacy of the economic success of Chinese economy. And so if the crisis turns out not to be a big boost for China, but an increasing stress, and if the U.S. sanctions and decoupling restricts China's ability to sell into the world, Xi is going to find himself in a world of trouble. And I think the argument is excellent. The argument is literate, it's clear, it's straightforward. It's a lot like the arguments that say this bear rally is dramatically overbought and the market's going to tank now because here are all the reasons why it should go down. I've been hearing these arguments about China being unable to survive and the system breaking down and falling into crisis when it can't meet the expectations of its citizens. I've been hearing those arguments for 20 or 30 years now. Just like the last month, everybody in the markets has been hearing, oh, the market's going to drop again quickly. But it hasn't. It's gone up. So China has gone from success to success, too. The basic question looking forward is, are you bearish on China or bullish? There are good reasons to think that China is actually going to face problems. On the other hand, right now, the U.S. response to the crisis has been so pathetic that China looks good in comparison. And the interesting question will be when things settle down after the fact, after the dust is settled, who looks more competent at the end of the day.
But Gideon, at the same time, we keep on hearing from President Trump that China hasn't given us a full picture of the number of deaths or how they've been dealing with it. So are we going to see a trade war-like post-virus phase? I mean, is the situation between China and the U.S. just going to get worse because of the virus?
Well, this is a great question because there's a functional logic to cooperation. Obviously, everybody can see it. Just like one state can't do a policy on the virus and have the next state screw it up by taking the opposite policy. So that works for countries, too, especially when you have transnational or global systems like trade. You can't, and other kinds of systems. You can't just opt out. China and the United States are so bound together, their fates are inextricably linked. The question is, given the demonstration of how bad that linkage can be when things go wrong, and given how much everybody wants to play a blame game and focus on exculpating themselves from responsibility and blaming the next guy rather than trying to actually constructively solve the crisis. The question is, will the emotions driven by the pandemic make people get into a pissing war with their opponents rather than working constructively? And we just don't know yet. The obvious, logical, positive answer for everybody would be for everybody to work together. Defunding the World Health Organization during the middle of a pandemic strikes me as exactly the opposite reaction. It's like, I'm going to take my cards and go home, even when in the middle of the crisis is still going on. The question should be how to recover from everybody's poor mistakes, cooperate better, and develop a functioning global mechanism to respond to these global crises. This demonstrates you can't have an America first or America only foreign policy because the entire world is interconnected. Our problems come from outside. They need to be solved with the other people outside.
All right, Gideon, thanks so much. Gideon Rose there, a magazine editor of Foreign Affairs, stays with us. Now, coming up later today, Ed Hyman, Evercore ISI founder and chairman. That's coming up at 10 a.m. in New York. That's 3 p.m. in London. A conversation on companies and their solvency. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. Tom and Francine from London and New York, working from home. I think, Tom, we're in week 4 or 5. I can't count the days or the weeks. Still with us, Gideon Rose, who is Foreign Affairs magazine editor. Gideon, when you look at some of the focus that we've been talking about, how does this pandemic change the relationship between governments and the social contract? And does it change more in Europe or even in the US? Are we going to talk more about a safety net? Are we going to see much more interventionist governments around the world?
Well, this is a great question, and there are two basic responses that are fighting each other. One is to turn inward, blame somebody for the crisis, try to protect yourself by removing yourself and hunkering down and reversing vulnerability. And the other possible trend is to recognize that in an interconnected world, we need more connection with others, with neighbors, with even opponents, because what happens to the guy in the next house can affect us. So you could imagine on the one hand, and you're seeing this, a hunkering down, an increase in tensions, a beggar thy neighbor, and a turn inward policy. But you can also see an obvious functional logic in which all the Faucis and Birxes of the world are on the same team, whatever country they're in, working together, and a lot of ordinary citizens respond to those people. And you could see a kumbaya-ish surge of not just human feeling with a 7 o'clock shout out to the health workers in New York, but a recognition that we are all together and equal in situations like this, and that we all deserve health care, we all deserve good treatment, and we all deserve governments that respond effectively to the needs and security and interests of their citizens. This could produce ultimately a demand for better government when people see what actually happened. The real question is, when the public at large, in its various capacities, responds to the obvious failures domestically and internationally and the costs and problems that this pandemic has revealed, will they respond by trying to make things better or just blaming somebody else and trying to move on with their old lives? We just don't know yet, and it'll be interesting to see. I think in the short term, there'll be a turn inward, but I think the long-term result will be actually a move counterintuitively towards a more connected world because the real answer here is we should have stopped this earlier. China shouldn't have lied. The international system should have worked. The United States should have responded quickly. We all should have basically gotten together early. That's not the message that everybody wants to hear right now, but it's the way to prevent the one next time.
What does that mean for Brexit and actually the UK? First, there was a little bit of a shift, and certainly you can see it in Boris Johnson's popularity because of a pretty scathing article by the Sunday Times and the Times over the weekend. But you also have an article in this edition of the magazine entitled Britain Adrift.
Yeah, Britain Adrift, and there's also a good piece by Matisse on Europe. And the challenge here, I think, really, the European Union has proceeded over the decades through crises towards new evolutions. Every few years, something bad happens. The existing institutions are seen to be insufficient to deal with the problems of the entire zone. And eventually, things got tighter and better. The question now is, in the last several years, this hasn't been working. Now the crises are so big, they're undermining it and splitting things up. Basically, Europe has not done well as an institution with the pandemic, obviously. It's broken down. All sorts of things have been gone the wrong direction from what the founders expected and what European actual policy was. But will the result of that be, oh, yes, this means the project was a mistake? Or does it mean we have to be even better at doing Europe than we have been? We just don't know yet. And, you know, it's anybody's guess, just like the market. It's going to go up or down. Everybody thinks they know what's going to happen in politics, and everybody is much more humble about the markets. But the fact the politics is just as hard to predict as the economics.
All right. Gideon Rose, thank you so much. I really can't say enough, folks, about the acuity you'll see at the Foreign Affairs website as they currently look at the pandemic, and in their new issue on climate change, some important essays, particularly on China, and Secretary Baker and Secretary Schultz with a timely essay as well. Gideon Rose does Foreign Affairs. Coming up, we're going to get an update on this virus. As Francine mentioned, things looking a little bit better in the United Kingdom, things looking better a little bit in the United States. Dr. Sharfstein will join again from the Johns Hopkins University. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Vivian Hurtado. Let's get your Bloomberg Business Flash. We begin with burger chain Shake Shack. It'll return its entire $10 million loan from the U.S. government. The loans are designed for small businesses hurt by the coronavirus. Last year, Shake Shack had sales of $595 million. Bloomberg has learned more than a dozen publicly traded companies with revenue topping $100 million received these loans. Now to speculation, the three biggest U.S. airlines may cut more than 100,000 jobs under the terms of a government bailout. American, United, and Delta can't slash jobs before September the 30th, but they've been warning employees cuts are almost inevitable. Well into 2021, the airlines face a bleak future of depressed traffic and volatile revenue. And we end with casino operator Wynn Resorts calling for parts of the Nevada economy to start reopening in May. CEO Matt Maddox saying the Las Vegas Strip should be open in the middle of the end or the end of the month. Wynn has released a 23-page proposal on how it will keep its casinos, hotel rooms, and guests safe. And that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom, Francine.
Viviana, thanks so much. Greatly appreciated this morning. In a quieter time and place, Professor Scharfstein of the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University would write essays like Influenza Vaccination and Migration at the U.S. Southern Border. Right now, he's focused on the pandemic and hospitals in Baltimore. We're thrilled that Joshua Scharfstein could join us this morning. I should point out also that Mr. Bloomberg, the founder of Bloomberg LP and this radio and television shop as well, has been a philanthropist for his Johns Hopkins University. Joshua, wonderful to catch up with you again. Through the theme of the week that Francine and I have seen is we're really beginning to see some constructive news of getting over the hump. Translate that into real-world medicine. Are we anywhere near over the hump? Are we anywhere near a glimmer of hope?
Well, what we have seen recently in the United States is a plateau, and that is good news because we clearly were worried about having so many people with severe disease from COVID that it would overwhelm the healthcare system. And there's no question that the healthcare system in several places, such as New York City, has been pushed really up to the brink, but there's just been an amazing medical response and extra beds and ventilators and staff coming in, and it looks like the line there is more or less holding, and these hospitals are not getting overwhelmed. So that is a very good news. However, it does not mean that, it's all over. It means that really the long-term battle is beginning, and it's very important that not only the current restrictions continue long enough for cases to really begin to decline, but also that we have a strategy for slowly reopening the economy.
I had a family member over the weekend, Professor Scharfstein, who took in the information of a nurse of about age 40 dying. Why are nurses dying? Why are doctors dying?
Well, this has been seen all around the world, including in China and Italy and Spain, and it may have to do with the fact that they were exposed to a very large amount of virus, perhaps before it was known that there was coronavirus in their area, or when they were unable to get adequate protective equipment. And the amount of virus someone's exposed to generally can influence how well people can fight off the infection. So that's one possible reason why. The other reason is that there's a certain randomness to this virus. There are people in the community who seem completely at low risk based on what we know, but nonetheless, they get seriously ill or even die. So, this is not a guaranteed harmless infection for anyone.
Could this be genetic? I know there are a number of studies, Josh, about whether you have a pre-genetic disposition for the virus to get worse. Where are we on that?
It's possible. I haven't seen any compelling data specifying which genes. Sometimes there are variations in the immune system that can predict vulnerabilities to infection. So, I think that would be very interesting if it's uncovered.
I know you were saying that we need to be vigilant against a new surge of cases as we start to lift restrictions. What would be the right way to do this? Do you take a state and the state reopens and you see what happens? Or do you look at another country? Or countries and states comparable in how their response has been, how the lockdown has been, and the number of deaths and infections?
So I think there are two things, and there's been a couple of very good reports that have been put out, including by the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. And the first thing is you have to think about what are the conditions for reopening? What do you want to have in place before we reopen? And the second thing is how do you go about it? And in that first category, what do you want to have in place? Adequate testing, which we don't really yet have, to really be able to test people who are sick, even mildly ill, as well as enough testing for high-risk places like nursing homes. You certainly want to see cases declining substantially for 14 days. You need the public health capacity to respond to positive cases, and you need to make sure that healthcare system that's been pushed to the brink in some areas has really bounced back so that you're able, if things get worse, to handle the challenge. And then you got to think about how you're going to open up, and it's not going to be flipping the switch back on. It's going to be slowly turning the dial, and you need to really think through what comes first, what comes second, what comes third, and in between each stage, waiting to make sure that you're not sparking a surge in cases. And there's some things that may be able to come first, like if there are workplaces where people don't sit anywhere near each other, but then there are things that are going to come later, like a big indoor concert that may come the latest of all. So you really need to be thoughtful about that. I think you're starting to see in the United States frameworks being discussed by governors, and I think that will be the roadmap that people follow.
Thank you so much. Josh Schafferstein there, Johns Hopkins University Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and, of course, Community Engagement and Bloomberg School of Public Health. Tom, we saw a reversal when it comes to equities here in Europe. They were rising, now they're down. Oil plunging below $14 a barrel, and Treasuries rising with the dollar, Tom.
West Texas Intermediate right now, folks, 13.06. That is extraordinary. Please stay with us through the day. Lawrence Kudlow later this morning. This is Bloomberg.
He leads the company that operates 4 of the most popular cable channels for women, producing a wealth of content distributed around the world. After helping to create MSNBC and CNBC, David Zaslav took the helm at Discovery in 2007, where he moved quickly to streamline the company and relaunch channels so he could take it public all within the span of a year. Since then, Discovery's market cap has quadrupled. And now, Discovery is coming to terms with a new world, one where viewers increasingly turn to streaming services for their programming and are moving away from Discovery's core business of traditional cable channels, leading Zaslav to make the biggest deal of his life, betting once again on content. On this edition of Bloomberg Big Decisions, David Zaslav.
David Zaslav, thank you for joining us. Great to have you.
Great to see you.
So you've just completed the biggest deal of your career, I believe, $12 billion for Scripps. Why did you do it?
Well, it's interesting. There's a financial reason, and there's also a strategic drive that we think could really work for us. Here, we're in the cable and free-to-air business. Scripps is in the cable and free-to-air business. And so we both do the same thing. It's what we do for a living. It's what we know how to do. It's what we do every day when we come to work. And so we feel that we're quite comfortable in putting these two companies together. And the synergy gives us the opportunity to, we think, have a target of doubling our free cash flow. So we generate about $1.4 billion in free cash flow. Scripps generates about $8 billion. And we think we can get to 2, 8, or 3 through revenue synergies by coming up with a lot of cost synergy, mostly cost synergy. And so in a turbulent time, if we can emerge with almost $3 billion of cash, it creates like a moat in a turbulent time. We're different than most media companies in the world, and there are a lot of great companies. But whether it's Disney or whether it's Rupert or Comcast, NBC, CBS, they're mostly in the scripted and movie business. Netflix, Amazon, that whole side of the business is focusing on, as if it was a soccer field, the ball is scripted series and scripted movies. So it's very crowded. It's getting very disrupted. And you know, the number of scripted series have gone from 200 to over 500. And Apple and Amazon and Netflix alone are spending almost $20 billion on top of these companies. So we look at that and we say that we're not that. We're on the other side of the business. The other side of the business is we own all of our content. It's real-life entertainment. We see ourselves as a global IP company, whether it's with Oprah, with Discovery, with Animal Planet, with ID and crime or science or cars. And with Scripps having food and HG and cooking and travel, we put it all together now, and we're on a different area of the field. And so we say very good luck to them. I think there's a lot of great companies. It's going to be very disrupted. And our game is to take those great brands around the world, and as people over the next few years look to pull content onto devices and phones, we think the functional value of food, home, cooking, science, cars, that we'll do better, or we have a chance to do better, than if we were, if somebody was going to pay to watch The Crown on a mobile phone. So a lot of it is about owning IP and figuring out a way to get to mobile where people will pull your content.
Well, let's talk about getting to mobile, because that's the big disruption everybody in media is talking about as a practical matter. How will this help you get to scale, as it were?
Well, we're about 20% of the viewership in the U.S. at any given time. And we have 4 of the top 6 or 7 cable channels for women with HG, Food, ID, TLC, and then we have OWN that's #1 for African American women. So I think we have a great menu to offer to an advertiser. Discovery is in 220 countries. We have an average of 10 channels in every country in the world. So we're kind of a factory machine of driving IP all around the world. And so we could do what very few media companies could do. We could do a global offering of food. We could do a global offering of all of our content.
In this new world of streaming, will viewers be watching for platforms like HGTV or Discovery, or will they be looking for programs like The Crown, like Game of Thrones?
Well, it's hard to tell behaviorally exactly what people are going to do. But by doing this deal and generating free cash flow and taking a look at the assets that we have, by owning science globally, by owning every piece of IP that we own effectively, except for sports, we're long IP. We've spent a lot of money to own it on all platforms. And that gives us the opportunity. If Amazon said, I'd like to do an offering globally, the only other media company that could do that would be Disney, and it would be in the kids space. And so we would raise our hand and say, terrific, we have a great family offering. And so for us, it's about the long tail. And we think in the end, people that love food are going to pull it. We're not sure exactly how it's going to work, but we think the fact that we own all of our content and we have passionate viewers that they love us like they love a sports team. They'll come home and they put on HG all day long, or they'll put on food. And so we have a sustainable growth business with our synergy. And then we have all this IP that we could take direct to consumer, and we've started to do it.
Can you win in streaming without going through the bundlers? I mean, do you have to be on Hulu? Do you have to be on YouTube? Or can you do it directly? Is your product strong enough?
We don't know. Everywhere else in the world, we're on almost every skinny bundle. Here in the US, we're in most of them. We're not on Hulu, and we're not on YouTube, but we're on most of the others. And people love our channels. And so, one, we think that over time we'll get on those skinny bundles. We hope to. We'd like to partner with our distributors because they helped us build our business. And in many cases we are. We're partnering with AT&T on DirecTV Now. We partner with Brian on Comcast on his offerings, with Charter. So that's the best way to do it, kind of regionally. But there is an opportunity for us to go direct to consumer ourselves, which we're already doing in a number of areas, in cars and in sports. But we could also go to those big companies. If you take a look at what NBC, ABC, CBS, and Fox spent 3 years ago, and how much is being spent by Amazon, Netflix, Apple, and Google, there's a massive amount of share shift that's going on there. And these are real global companies, the likes of which we've never seen before. So if any one of those companies wanted to offer for $5.99 a compelling family-friendly service, we would either be most of it, we would argue we'd like to be most of it, or we could be all of it and see how it goes. Because anywhere you go in the world and you say Discovery or Animal Planet or ID or Oprah, people know our brands and they value them.
How will you make that decision about whether you go direct to consumer or you go through middlemen, essentially? How do you make that decision as CEO?
Well, look, right now it's not a fair fight because the direct-to-consumer businesses, the Netflix, the Amazons, we in media used to trade at about a 14 multiple because the view was that this great dual revenue stream cable and free-to-air business would go on forever. And the view now is that it's getting disrupted by some of these direct-to-consumer platforms that are global. There's a question of who's going to emerge and be the winner. We think, looking now, it's only the second or third inning, but we've carved out a very compelling spot of quality brands that people love, that we can offer globally, and we could offer them ourselves.
You stepped up big time on sports. That was a variation from what people had expected from you. Why does that make sense for you? You talk about disruption in media. There was a time not too long ago when you were the disruptor in chief, in some sense. I watched you from Capital Cities ABC across the street as you created MSNBC and NBC. You created CNBC. How does this compare with that disruption when you disrupted broadcast? Basic cable came in and really disrupted it. How does it compare? What did you learn from that experience you can apply now?
Patience. In that case, Jack Welch and Bob Wright were committed to try and take the broadcast business into cable. For people that were around at that time, it was pretty unusual. And it's important because the business that you think you're going to launch that's going to work is never the business that works. The audience is always going to tell you what they get nourished by. And that's what our business is about. That's what most businesses are about. When we launched with Oprah, the Oprah Winfrey Network, we had a dream, Oprah and I, that it was going to be about living your best life.
Order submitted.
And we
Order
looked strategically at the space and said, we can do this. But when we went out with the content, Super Soul Sunday worked terrific, but a lot of the other stuff was too earnest and the audience went away. And we had to figure out, what are they going to come back for? And it took us a lot of years, but we started to listen, what do you like? That's what our business is about. We don't want everyone to watch. But the Oprah Winfrey Network now is the #1 network for African American women. So for us now, we've broken our company in half, essentially. We got half the company that's about growing our channels, doing what we believe we can do as well or better than anyone in the world. Then there's a whole group that has to figure out, okay, how do I get over the top? What do people want when they consume content over the top? You know, and I think you have to be willing to recognize failure and use it kind of optimistically. Good, we know that now.
And you can do it without the blockbusters.
The way people watch our channels, they don't. It is hit driven if you're a broadcast network. The way people watch our channels, they come home and HG gets me. Discovery is my channel. TLC in Middle America is the channel that I love. I love Oprah. That's the channel that I watch. That's how they curate. Where do I get nourished? That's the business that we're in. We think that's going to be sustainable, and we think that ultimately they could either pull one of those really big, expensive platforms, or when they're looking to pull something that they want that's family friendly, with brands they know, characters they know, everywhere in the world, for a lot less than they would have to pay for that, we look different. And we got to, over time, we'll see if it's an aggregated offering, if it's an individual offering, but I think we got a game. But the first thing we got to do is execute on this.
You stepped up big time on sports. That was a variation from what people had expected from you. Why does that make sense for you?
Well, first, we're in every country. So when I say we're in every country, we have a sales team, we have a distribution team, we have creative people, we have marketing people, and we have strategic people. So we kind of know each country. And so when we looked at sports, Eurosport was not being individually fed into every country across Europe. So when we bought Eurosport several years ago, we looked and said, we can use our sales infrastructure. We could use our distribution infrastructure to drive more carriage. We could use our sales and marketing people. And it was a little bit of a leap, but it was driven by the idea that content used to be about getting inside of the television box, that rectangle. And even if you had content that was just okay, second or third choice, you did okay. When we launched our direct-to-consumer sports player 3 years ago in Europe, so we reach across 750 million people in Europe. We have the tennis, we have the cycling, we have the winter sports, we have summer sports, we have the Olympics. So we figured we have a great offering. 750 million people.
Order filled.
$8,
Order
we should be
submitted.
able to do terrific.
Order
and we
submitted.
wrote 10 things that we thought we knew for sure. 8 of them were wrong. And the users told us. They said, okay, you know, we tuned in for the French Open, but we didn't want to watch Tour de France. We love tennis. Or
Order
they
filled.
told us that
Order submitted.
maybe the most interesting
Order
takeaway
submitted.
that we applied to the Olympics is that when people consume content on a device, they expect to hit the device when they get up in the morning and see content. And then they expect a few hours later to hit that device. You need to multiple publish. So if speed skating is starting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon,
Order
the people who love
submitted.
speed skating have to get up in the morning and see a 1-minute video or 2 one-minute videos or some information about, and we downloaded 700 pieces of short-form content in 21 languages every day to our Olympic player. And that's one of the reasons why we were able to aggregate about 500,000 subscribers. They love the sports IP, but they really, when people look at
Order
content
canceled.
on a device,
Order
they
canceled.
expect to be
Order
entertained
submitted.
and
Order
nourished
filled.
whenever
Order
they hit
submitted.
it. And if
Order
you hit it and
submitted.
nothing is new, you're disappointed.
Can you do that and not step up into the really high-priced sports projects? Because that, to some extent, sounds a little bit like ESPN in the United States in the early days. They had lesser sports, and then they had to get in the NFL. They had to get in the NBA, and that, as you know, costs enormous amounts of money. Can you have a strategy that stops short of that?
Well, opportunistically, we have taken football. But we haven't taken football where we get in a bidding war with anyone. If you want to offer your content on a pan-European basis, there's only one place to do it, us. Or if you're a federation, if you're the Speed Skating Federation, you could sell it in every country. And the difference between the U.S. and Europe is in the U.S., it's one culture, one language, and everybody likes the same four sports, essentially. 90% of viewing, 80% of viewing is football, baseball, basketball, hockey. In Europe, there's a lot of sports that are number one in Northern Europe that are number 10 in Southern Europe. And if you're a federation, you know, we're the one stop. And we've been very effective about getting a lot of content. And all the sports content we have with Eurosport, we've, as much as we can, we've gotten it long term, and we own it on all platforms.
You have scripts, as you say, you need to execute on that now. But is that enough for Discovery? Are you on the outlook for further acquisitions?
This is news, but not as you know it.
Order canceled.
This
Order
is
canceled.
TikTok by Bloomberg, the first and only global news network built for Twitter. 24/7 news streaming live on Twitter.
have scripts, as you say, you need to execute on that now. But is that enough for Discovery? Are you on the outlook for further acquisitions? Do you need to get bigger scale?
Well, look, as I said earlier, we're in a different place of the soccer field than everyone else. So we think if we could execute on this, own all those passion brands globally. Scripps never took food and HG and cooking and travel around the world. So we have an opportunity to take all that IP, we'll convert it into 48 languages, and we'll start to spread it around. So that'll be a revenue synergy if viewership increases, and we think it will. In Latin America, we've bought some of their content. But I like our hand here. We got some work to do. We got to pay down some debt. We got to prove out that we're going to generate that free cash flow and that we really did build a moat. But at the same time, we're going to be working really hard about learning how consumers consume content on devices. And we're talking to every distributor, because we're better off if somebody that's already in business with you and you're already paying a $100 bill can then have a chance to check a box and pick us. Today in the U.S., there's probably 25 or 30 million subscribers that are broadband only. The one service that's being marketed to them heavily is Netflix. And the industry built us, we built them, and together I think we're going to come up with something that's going to be pretty compelling in terms of a skinny bundle, because it's not sensible to have Netflix have all that field without us on it.
You said you need to pay down some debt, because you do have more debt on your balance sheet than a lot of other media companies do. You've said you're going to save $350 million a year on Scripps. How are you going to do that? That's a lot of money, as you and I both know, to save in an operation.
Well, look, as we've looked at putting these businesses together, and it's early days, it's only been 5 weeks, but we've been working on it very hard for 6 months going up to it. We think that's rather conservative. These are one-over-one companies. We have 12 channels in the U.S., they have 6. So we're in the same business. We have 220 research people, they have 140 research people. We have 650 salespeople, they have 550 salespeople. And their people are really good. We put some of their people in charge in our new structure. And the idea is, who are the best and the brightest? Because when we looked at it, we said when it comes to nonfiction, who are the best 2 producers of nonfiction content, and who is best at monetizing it? And we looked and we said, in some areas they're better than us, in some areas we're better than them. We put these 2 together, and we will spend $3.5 billion on content, maybe growing to more than that. This is a hard business. We're in the business of creating stories and characters and getting people to turn on their TV and love it.
You've referred a couple of times to John Malone, who's a shareholder, doesn't control your company by any means, but you know him well. What is it like to have John Malone as somebody you can call up and say, should we do this, should we do that? What do you think about what's going on?
Well, I think about my last 30 years in this business, and it's sort of like what you want for your children. You are who you hang out with. And it really helps define you, the narratives that you hear, the questions that you hear. And so I look back over the last 30 years and 15 years listening to why Jack didn't want to do an acquisition that we brought him, or what we need to do with cable, or how we need to do it. Bob Wright, one of the most successful guys running NBC, the Newhouse family, Donald and Cy Newhouse, and Bob Myron, who's a genius and has been in the cable business and built Bright House, and John Malone. And so when I think about where people should be spending their time, yes, you'd like to get the right job. Yes, you'd like to think that you're going to make some money. But I took a 50% pay cut to go to NBC from a law firm, because I thought I can get to hang out with the guys at the Peacock, and maybe someday I'll get to meet Jack. And a lot of the way I see the world, I still talk to Jack all the time. So I'm hearing Jack's voice, I'm hearing Bob Myron and Donald Newhouse's voice, and I'm hearing John's voice. And so for that alone, I'm one of the luckiest guys.
It strikes me that you're now running Discovery, which really appeals in the United States to a lot of the middle of the country. People that the President of the United States probably wouldn't object to. In fact, I understand the President of the United States is a fan of Shark Week. Actually, I read that someplace.
I hope he's a fan of a lot of our stuff. I hope.
You helped create MSNBC. That is a channel in a very different place. What do you think about the media landscape today in the United States in terms of politics? Because it seems to become much more polarized.
Well, I can just say that the business changed. When we launched MSNBC, Brokaw and I and Andy Lack and Tom Rogers, there was a group of us, and Jack said, we're going to launch the best news network in America, and we're going to use the #1 news division in the world to do it. We had this amazing library. We structured a deal with Microsoft to get them in. They wanted the library at the time, and that was our ambition. I'm not going to game out the different news networks in America, but we have to be practical and recognize that at least some of them are following that model, because you on the one hand you want to do the best journalism possible. On the other hand, you want people to watch you, and you want them to watch you for as long as possible. And part of the way we as human beings determine our success is, are we in third place? Are we in second place? How many people are watching us? How many people love us? And so I think that's the journey. And luckily, I'm not going to be one of the guys to figure that out.
Well, but let's talk about how you keep score. That leads us exactly to a great conclusion here. How do you keep score? I mean, I see that now you've jumped up in the rankings, actually, including broadcast and cable. Big step up with Scripps. Is that the way you keep score? Is that how you just tell whether you, David Zaslav, are succeeding?
No, because there's lots of books that have been written about, more scale tips you over. So we're staying in our lane. And what's going to be successful for us, and we've made this decision, on every one of our channels, we've said, if you don't love us, if you're not one of the passionate viewers that loves survival, if you're not one of the people that love science or that love crime, go find some other channels that you love. When we're creating content for our channels, we want global audiences that really affiliate and have a passion for our characters and our message. And a big piece of that is we're not going for the best rating. We're going for the most potent audience that says, they get me. When I go there, I see something that I love. And if we put something on any of these channels that looks like we're going for ratings, they'll immediately say, what's this doing on here? And so they're quite clever, and you just got to continue. This is what we do for a living. Figure them out on TV and try and figure them out in terms of the devices as to what they're going to love and what they're going to pay for.
David Zaslav, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thanks, David. Good to see you.
Coca-Cola, a 130-year-old iconic brand and a dominant force in the $800 billion soft drink industry. Synonymous with globalization, Coca-Cola operates in over 200 countries worldwide. The beverage behemoth now has a new CEO. James Quincy spent the last 2 decades rising through the ranks at Coca-Cola. Now, as head of the company, Quincy aims to win over a new generation that shuns sugar, and to show the world that he takes the environment seriously, even as he adapts to a new world of technology. James Quincy sat down with us for an extended conversation. We wanted to understand how he plans to use innovation to transform every aspect of Coca-Cola, attempting to change its culture while managing a global checkerboard of regulations and tax regimes.
Coca-Cola operates in a lot of different countries, which means there's a lot of different regulatory systems, a lot of different legal schemes you have to really adapt to. Let's talk about a couple of those. First of all, the United States. The tax cuts. How does it affect Coca-Cola?
Yeah, we're still working through the numbers. I mean, our tax rate last year effectively was about 24%, so it's not the biggest change to us. Because we're an international company, the absolute rate hasn't affected us as much as perhaps some of the more domestically focused enterprises. But we're positive on removing the territorial system. So we think the simplification is positive in the long run. To the extent that it helped create more demand, that will be good news too. We're still working through the numbers that we'll lay out on our earnings call. Of course, we're part of having some of the money overseas, but in the end, if it generates more economic growth, that will lift all the boats.
Does the expensing of capital investment affect you at all?
Not in a great amount. I mean, it will make some difference. We'll lay that out, but that's not the biggest moving piece for us.
And if there is significant incremental cash available to Coca-Cola, have you decided yet, does it go into capital investment? Does it go into buybacks of shares? Does it go into dividends?
I mean, we weren't short of cash at the end of the day, so we've been a successful company. We've got the resources we need to invest in the marketplace. We're still working through exactly how the puts and takes work, because obviously you've got to pay tax on the cash first, or in addition. So we're looking at how we use all that and how we make the right capital allocations.
One of the really big issues for the United States right now is the so-called dreamers. These are the young people who are brought here as children. And the question is, do they get to stay as adults, essentially? Do you have at Coca-Cola people who are really uncertain about whether they can stay or not? There are about 700,000 more or less nationwide.
Yeah, we have some people in our company and in our bottling partners who fall under the Dreamers or the DACA program. We would love government to find a way to make proper underlying immigration reform, and including finding a solution for the Dreamers so that it's not so disruptive and that they can stay. So hopefully they'll find a path to that. Of course, partial solutions may be necessary, but we would love to see fundamental reform.
You ran Mexico for Coca-Cola at one point, so you have seen this issue on both sides of at least our southern border. Do you see a path forward, a constructive path forward on immigration?
I think there's a path forward, but I think it also is connected, and it can't be completely disassociated when you think about long-term fundamental reform from getting both economies to grow. In the end, part of what drives the informal immigration is the disparity in the economic outlook. So having a community of North America where all the economies are growing actually helps solve that problem too. So I think leadership from the United States to drive growth will help solve some of these other issues too.
You've also seen NAFTA from both sides of the border. You've seen that issue, which is another hot issue right now in the United States. Has NAFTA overall been good or bad for the United States?
My view would be that free trade deals are good overall for all participants, and I think it's been good for North America and all the countries in it. Doesn't mean it's perfect. Very few free trade deals are perfect. So can it be made better? Yes, I hope they can make it better. But I don't think we should start deconstructing global trade. I think it's been a powerful engine for lifting all boats. It doesn't mean it solved all problems. There are questions of income inequality. There are questions of not all the rules were perfect and need to be improved. But let's go forward, not backwards.
So when President Trump first came in, he was very closely allied with many people in business. He consulted, and he had panels that he talked with as well. Do you get to talk, either President Trump or the administration, about things like NAFTA? I mean, do they consult you, or do you make your views known to them?
When there are things where we have a view or it affects our business, we make our views known either directly to the administration or through many of the business forums, like the Business Roundtable. There are enough points of intersection collectively and individually with the administration that they know what we think.
So from that, do you have any sense of where we're headed with NAFTA? Because there's conflicting reports. I mean, the Canadians seem to be preparing for actually U.S. withdrawal. There are a lot of people in Washington say, no, we're not going to withdraw. Do you have any sense from your point of view of where we're headed?
My view on negotiations is you've got to let the negotiations negotiate. And if you're not in the room, you don't know what the answer is until it comes out. So I think the important thing for those that aren't in the room is to keep saying what they believe to be true, what they believe to be the areas where things can be made better. And then the negotiators have got to get in the room and thrash it out, and trying to work out what color the smoke is coming from the room doesn't lead you anywhere until they come out and tell you what the answer is.
Your native country has voted in a referendum to leave the EU. And I won't ask you what you think about that, but tell us how that's developing. I mean, is there a soft landing there that you can see? How would we get to it?
It does a bit go back to my point about negotiations. You're never really sure until till the cake is cooked. I think the logic of the economics is a softer rather than a harder Brexit. I think in the end, whilst it won't be a catastrophe one way or the other, life will be better. There'll be more economic growth if it's a softer Brexit, but there's a lot of details and a lot of different points of view to work out, because in the end, the referendum wasn't between do you want this or that. It's like, do you want this or not want this? It wasn't a referendum around the version of the exit, which is kind of where we're trapped at the moment. And of course, there's a lot of negotiations going on. It's very important to get it right for the UK and to some extent for Europe as well.
Whether it's Brexit or whether it's NAFTA, how do these trade issues affect Coca-Cola's business?
I think one of the great benefits of the Coca-Cola system is we're global, but we're extremely local. I mean, we manufacture in every country virtually that we sell in. Virtually everything that's sold in the US is made in the US. Virtually everything that's sold in Mexico is made in Mexico. Virtually everything that's sold in the UK or France is made in that individual country. So the global trade restrictions or openings don't tend to affect us heavily in the moment. To the extent that they reduce or increase total economic growth, that's what matters to us. And so I think philosophically, we're pro global free trade because it drives economic growth. Therefore, let's focus on making those deals better because it will provide the wealth to then solve a lot of society's problems.
You came in and took over Coca-Cola and really trumpeted innovation as critical to your future. I believe you have a chief innovation officer, but maybe you're the chief innovation officer in some sense. How do you innovate in a 130-year-old company that's so well known around the world, has been there for so long, has such an entrenched perception of people's views?
It's hard. I mean, any institution that's been around a long time, whether it's a company or a government or any organization, it's going to be very hard. So I think, from my point of view, if I'm not the chief innovator, I'm certainly the chief agitator for innovation. And what that means is, driving the culture to try and do a few things upon top of everything else we do. Stay curious. If we're not curious about the outside world, about the consumers, about the customer, about what's changing, how will we innovate? But curiosity just leads you to an insight. It's very passive. You need to drive empowerment so people feel they can go and do something, that they're not waiting for head office to make the decision, that they can get up in the morning and go and do something. And I think the next thing is you've got to be inclusive. You've got to try and connect the pieces because we've got a tremendous global knowledge and tremendous global system. Sometimes your idea has already been tried somewhere else. So connect to the other parts of the system. And lastly, we probably fell into the trap of trying to make things perfect before we did anything in the past. No, we need to learn from some of the software companies, have version 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. That gets us both innovation and speed. And if we keep pushing those four things, I think we'll make progress.
And how do you know? How does James Quincy know whether you're getting the innovation job done? And I mean that in the sense you're sitting atop a very large organization, a lot of people spread around the world. How do you judge whether the word's getting down and people are already changing their behavior?
It's hard to know, but the only way forward is to look for multiple signals. There's no one number, one metric that's going to give it the answer. We have employee surveys where we ask people. We can look at the sales number and measure the success rate, or the number and the success rate of the things we put into the marketplace. We can look at what our research and development pipeline is generating, and are we really getting new patents? Are we really making progress? So I think one has to have a dashboard to look across and say, is there progress?
How is technology changing the way you do business, and for that matter, your workforce?
This is news.
Order
but
filled.
not as you know
Order
it.
submitted. Order
This
submitted.
is TikTok by Bloomberg, the first and only global news network built for Twitter. Objective reporting that you can trust. Curated comments that
Order
provide
canceled.
insight.
Order canceled.
TikTok by Bloomberg. 24/7 news streaming live on Twitter.
Order filled. Order filled.
Technology. It's disrupting just about every company that we know of today. How is it affecting Coca-Cola? And first, talk about how it's affecting your relationship with your consumer. How you deliver to your consumer, things like e-commerce, how you market to your consumer.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of look at it in three buckets. How we engage with consumers, there used to be TV advertising, now there's social media. The ways of engaging with the consumer are changing rapidly. Who the customer is and how the shopping actually happens is changing rapidly. And of course, internally it's changing rapidly. With the consumer, around the world, TV is still the biggest vehicle, maybe less so in some of the developed economies, but around the world it's still the biggest vehicle. But a lot of it's going into social media. We work closely a lot of the new tech companies in social media, trying to find ways to continue to have a brand role. I mean, in the end, someone's got to pay for the content to be developed, whether that's through advertising or sponsorship. So I think there's a lot of change going on. We're adapting. I think we feel we're kind of towards the front end. But what I'm totally clear of is going to be different in 5 years, and it's going to be very different in 10 years. And we're going to have to keep investing in innovation
canceled.
and
Order
keep evolving
canceled.
to
Order
stay
submitted.
close to the consumers.
Order
As
submitted.
you look around the world, which markets do you see the fastest innovation when it comes to e-commerce? When we just sort of get on your app and you order something up, it gets delivered, for example. Is it China? Is it the United States? Is it Europe?
I actually think that places like Shanghai and some parts of Western Europe are on the cutting edge, along with some of the bits of the U.S. But really at a par. I mean, the U.S. in many respects, there's a lot of advanced e-commerce, but I can tell you it's very advanced in places like Shanghai and Western Europe as well. And the penetration of e-commerce in aggregate is even higher in some of those places than even the U.S. So, when you want to learn what's going on, I would be just as tempted to tell you go to Shanghai as stay in New York.
And how do you market in that circumstance? I mean, we're used to going to a fast food restaurant, for example, and there's a Coca-Cola there. It's on the menu.
Yeah.
So let's have that Coke or that Diet Coke.
Yeah.
You don't have that when you're on your app.
No, but you have to get it. I mean, if you went back even 2 or 3 years in China, for example, when a lot of the apps and the mobile payment systems came in, we weren't on the menu. Actually, worse. We were trying to sell perhaps a returnable glass bottle to the restaurant, which had no way of being in the delivery system. So we've had to re-engineer our business system very quickly to both be present on the app. So what's the virtual representation of what you'd normally see in the store? And how do we change the packaging portfolio so that we can be part of the delivery system? And you have a lot of places in Shanghai where food ordered on apps and delivered is 30–50% of the restaurant sales.
That's the relationship with the consumer. Talk about Coca-Cola as Coca-Cola. How is technology changing the way you do business, and for that matter, your workforce?
It's changing it in lots of profound ways. I mean, in simple terms, you know, you go back 10, 20 years, we were a large company and we're one of the few that could afford to invest in expensive IT systems and do our own stuff, our own programs, our own server farms. You wind forward to today, that's no longer the model. We've had to move to the cloud. We've had to move to standard programs that whole industries use, and we had to use the mobile. The one thing I always say to the IT department is, just put it on the phone. Everything can be done on the phone. Let's just move everything to mobile on the phone. The old days of IT had training budgets. Why? Everyone knows how to use the apps on the phone. So it's profoundly changing the way that we work, and I think it's going to continue to flow through the organization. We have a big program of digitizing the company.
Does that translate into fewer employees as a practical matter because of the efficiencies from digital?
I think for sure it changes into a different profile. I mean, people are having to adapt to doing things in a different way. We've actually made a lot of changes in our IT departments to move to a different skill set. So it's certainly changing the nature of employment and the sorts of profiles you want. Whether we buy the services ourselves or we buy the services or do it ourselves makes a difference as to where the employees are. But net, more employment's being generated in the economies.
So can Coca-Cola compete with Silicon Valley and the digital startups when you're trying to recruit the young computer scientists?
Well, Atlanta is a very fast-growing economy. The state of Georgia has been ranked, you know, top 1 or 2 of place to do business in the U.S. for many years in a row. The local political system has done a great job. So has the city. So it's a very competitive economy there, and we do very well in it. We're happy to see Atlanta and Georgia growing, and they've done a lot to invest in tech startups and the media industry in and near Atlanta, and it's being very successful.
As you look toward really substantial growth in these new beverage categories, are you looking at acquisitions? Are you looking at organic growth? I mean, you have been inclined, I believe, to look for smaller brands, startup brands, bringing them along. Is that the future path to a significant degree for Coca-Cola?
I think it's going to be both. I mean, we have grown organically, but we have made these bolt-on acquisitions, as we call them, the little small ones, the niche brands. I think where we see that something is a really good idea, we invest in them. Sometimes we buy them, sometimes we just invest with them. But there's a quid pro quo. They get the capital that we inject, yet we can introduce them to the globe, not just the country that they've launched in. And that's helped us double the number of billion-dollar brands that we sell around the world. So I think it's going to be an strategy rather than one or the other.
It's interesting. It's a total beverage company. It's not a food company. I mean, there are some competitors who said, let's become a food company, at least in part. Why did you make that decision? And does it make you any more vulnerable, forgive me for saying, but even to acquisition? I mean, you're what, $200 billion market cap? It's a pretty big acquisition. But there are some pretty big consolidations in the food industry out there.
I think firstly, you know, we're focused on beverages because that's where the greatest synergy and the greatest application of our know-how and our fabulous global bottling distribution system is. It's the thing that can be most synergistic with what we've already got. And the market for beverages is one of the best growing markets in the whole of the supermarket or in the other stores. So it's a great market. We have a good position. We can create a lot of synergy. So it's a question of choices. I sometimes say never say never, which then causes confusion because people say you haven't ruled anything out. I say no. It's a question of what's most logical, and beverages are the most not logical thing for us to do. First, because we stick to our need. In terms of how we think about the consolidation, in the end of the day, I'm pretty convinced that investors, gold star goes to those that grow with expanding margins. Growth is the name of the game. If the category's got no growth, then optimize the margin. Okay, but that's still silver prize largely over the long term. So I'm pretty clear. If we focus on driving top-line growth, which we believe we can with our strategy of total beverages, we will attract an investor base that will be very happy with us over the long run.
By 2030, you want to be getting a bottle back for every one you put out there. That's a lot of bottles for Coca-Cola. How are you going to attract all that plastic? World without waste. Great goal. You have a big new packaging announcement. Why is it important to Coca-Cola, not just as a corporate citizen, but as a business?
You know, it's important to us for a very core part of our values. We've always believed that to have a healthy business, you need to be operating in a healthy community. And one of today's biggest problems is packaging waste. We've done a lot on making things recyclable. We've actually invested a lot of R&D in making progress on reusing it. What we need to do is collect it. So this announcement is about the big missing piece in generating a world without waste, which is collecting back the plastic and creating a market economy for that collected plastic. And I think that's going to do great things to help us grow into the future without creating waste, which is good for us and it's great for communities.
How are you going to attract all that plastic? By 2030, you want to be getting a bottle back for every one you put out there. That's a lot of bottles for Coca-Cola. How are you going to attract all that plastic?
Well, to give you an idea of the dimension, we need to bring back, every person in the world, if they bring back 2 bottles a month, we bring back all our bottles. That's our objective. 2 bottles a month for every person. We collect every bottle we put out. How are we going to do it? Well, there'll be different systems in different countries. You know, every country needs a solution, but it won't be the same everywhere. There are kind of places where it's reasonably advanced in Europe to more informal economies where the collection happens. So there's going to be different solutions everywhere. We're going to have to work with NGOs, other industrial companies and governments to put in place these solutions. But it's absolutely doable. And I think that's what's exciting about setting the objective.
We're very conscious of this in the United States, but what about in other places, like China, for example?
Yeah, look, I think the emerging and the developed countries are where more of the problem is than the US or Europe, which is probably at the leading edge. So we need to do more there. But recognize in a lot of these countries, there is some informal collection system already going on across a wide range of waste. What we need to create is the circular economy. We need to create value for that. So often in the case, and we did this in Mexico, for example, you go back a little more than 10 years, it was less than 10% of the plastic was recycled. Now it's 60%. How? The informal economy was collecting the waste, but there was no market for it. No one wanted to buy it. So we went into the marketplace and bought the plastic, invested in factories to recycle that and reuse it in our bottles. So I think there's a model there for the Chinas and other parts of the world on how to create value out of plastic and get it reused.
You've laid out a bold strategic vision for your company called Total Beverage Company that includes things beyond Coca-Cola and even beyond Diet Coke. It goes on beyond that to these 5 categories. What's driving that? Is that basically to get away a bit from sugar drinks?
Actually, you know, we're following the consumer. When you look at what's happening around the world, as the world is urbanizing, as people have got more disposable income, they're spending more money on a range of things, including beverages. So what's important within that growing market of beverages is they want more choice. Different people want different things. So if we really want to be able to serve the customer, serve the consumer, we've got to follow them. We've got to get into more categories. Coke is likely to remain the heart and soul of the company. It's the world's biggest fast-moving consumer good brand. But we need more. We need to offer consumers what they want all day long. We have to offer choice. And I think that's what's going to guide us forward. And in a way, it goes back to where we started. If we pay a lot of attention to what the consumer wants, they will take us to where the business needs to grow. And then it ultimately ends up in growth for the business.
I understand that on average around the world, people consume about 8 ounces of a beverage per day. And Coca-Cola, I was told, is about a half an ounce. What is your goal? How much of the market share of total beverage can you really take globally?
I mean, I don't think there's a end of history moment when we reach nirvana. I think what we're looking to do is gain share every year. I mean, it's a competitive marketplace. We have a lot of well-funded competitors doing a lot of exciting things. So we're focused on is can we serve the consumers and gain a little bit of share each year and generate a growing business system. That our objective is to create value for everyone who touches that business system, whether it be the economics of the people who are in the value chain like the customer, or even society with initiatives like the packaging one, you know, which I think builds on our heritage of creating shared value in the world. You know, 10 years ago or so, we set ourselves the objective of being water neutral by 2020, and we achieved it a few years early. So we return to the environment all the water we use, which is one of the things that gives us confidence that we can achieve this packaging objective. So we get business growth and doing it in the right way for society.
Okay, thanks very much. We're going to wrap it up there. This was terrific. Thank you so much. That was really fun.
Thank you.
Order submitted. Order submitted. Order filled. Order submitted. Order submitted. Order filled.
Oil plunging 37%, cratering demand, storage increasing, and a contract rollover putting severe pressure on front-month oil. And closer, the White House and Democrats inch towards a deal expanding the payroll protection program as small businesses clamor for more funding. and the bad bank hopes. The ECB is discussing the idea of a bad bank to offload non-performing loans from lenders, as Italy's Prime Minister calls again for joint bond issuance and the full firepower of the EU. Welcome to Bloomberg Daybreak on this Monday, April 20th. I'm Alex Steele. The only thing you need to know at this moment is that oil is trading at $11 and change. In the front month, that's the May contract. That's going to have some distortions. Oil is trading a little bit better in the U.S. in further out months, particularly when you get to August and September. But nonetheless, it's a contract rollover story, but brutal, brutal number. $11. There's some conversation about potentially going into negative territory for certain grades as you try and sell them and get off the market. All of that leading U.S. equities to the lows of their session, the futures market, and sort of a mixed bid for the dollar. Well, here for more on markets is Seema Shah, Principal Global Investors Chief Strategist. Seema, I get that the oil sell-off today is sort of technically driven by a contract roll, but it's not like we're going to go back up to 60 tomorrow. What does $11 oil mean to the market?
Hi, Alex. I think the interesting thing here is it's reminding the market that equities is signaling something completely different to what maybe reality is, in that this is a demand story. Of course, there are supply issues, and as you said, there's technicals involved as well. But the reason it's at so low is because there is absolutely no demand for oil at the moment, given that economic activity is so low. And with recoveries looking like they're going to be very prolonged, very slow, it does mean that you're not going to see a very sharp recovery in oil prices anytime soon.
I like that you say that, because I've been trying to address this over the last couple of days. If you just take a look at a S&P chart over 6 months, it has been almost a pure V-shaped recovery in the equity market, but the underlying data nowhere near finding its bottom. How do you trade something like that?
No, exactly. And I think the interesting thing is here with the S&P is, you almost have to drill into what's going on sector by sector, and there's two very clear winners. Sorry. There's healthcare and there's big tech. And those are the two that are really driving those gains. If you look at other parts of the market, some of them are still in bear market, and compare that to European benchmark indices and US small cap, and that's showing a very, very different story to the S&P 500.
So what do you do about that? I mean, do you just go buy healthcare and tech? Like, is that going to be the pain trade? Just higher equities despite the fact that earnings are going to fall out and only two sectors are really going to be good?
Order filled. Order submitted. Order submitted. You said pain trade, which I think is exactly right. I think the pain trade at the moment is that the market's going to keep going higher. So if you're underweight equities, it's going to be a very, very tough time.
Order
and
submitted.
Keep in mind that there's also a number of technicals at play at the moment as well. As you've seen volatility lower, then there's going to be all the risk priority investors who are flooding back into the market. Now, I think this is going to play out for a little bit longer, so it makes sense to have exposure to US equities and really focus out on stuff like technology and healthcare. But then we actually prefer credit at this stage because valuation-wise, that looks a lot more attractive than equities.
Where in the credit market?
It's, follow the Fed.
Order
Wherever
filled.
the Fed goes, you
Order
have to go.
submitted.
So investment
Order
grade
submitted.
is clearly
Order filled.
doing well.
Order
but also,
submitted.
of course, the fallen
Order
angels side
submitted.
of the high yield market. You have to be really careful of the rest of high yield, because the general theme at the moment is, wherever possible from a fundamental perspective, it's looking at higher quality. So there's higher quality within high yield, higher quality within investment grade, and generally across universes, trying to pinpoint those companies who have got the balance sheets to withstand this kind of event, and also that are really looking to invest for the future, so that when they come out on the other side of this, they're able to do well.
So when you see something like Ford on Friday, for example, getting into the market, and they were able to issue it at 10% yield versus, say, 11 where they originally marketed, like that, is that a quote-unquote good thing for you? Is that like, okay, great, like that's a sign of a credit that we want to be in, kind of thing?
Order submitted. Order submitted.
I think, yeah. I mean, with those kind of things, again, as I said, you have to look at the balance sheet, know what are they planning to do. And there are technicals involved that I think it makes sense to follow. But it's going to be a question of timing, of when do you think that this trade is almost run out and the market starts to remember that actually the outlook for the global economy is still pretty weak. A lot of these Fed programs are helping from a very strong technical side, but it doesn't really take out the idea that bankruptcies are still going to be rising. There's still going to be defaults. And at some point, the market is guaranteed to remember that.
So let's just round out the earnings conversation in the U.S. when it comes to FANGs, for example. They're nearing overbought levels. We get some big names coming out this week. How are we to understand potentially overbought tech into earnings where they're the best player, but it's not like they're going to see tremendous growth necessarily either?
Order submitted. Order submitted.
Yeah, with FANGs, I guess that the interesting thing about FANG is there's also a structural story at play, which is likely to be sustained even beyond the current period. This kind of shifting to working from home, this greater reliance for businesses, for households and technology does mean that those ones are likely to outperform probably over the long term. And maybe there will certainly be volatility as you see the valuations playing out and investors coming in and out of the market. But I think from if you're looking at a longer term story, then maybe big tech is the area which is actually going to do well over a longer term basis.
Which puts Europe in a really bad spot because they don't have the kind of tech companies that the U.S. does. They're more going to be bank and energy driven. What do you expect, I guess your base case, into Thursday's EU summit in terms of this is what you want to see, this is what we will see?
Oh, I think we'll see something. So I don't think it's going to be everything that certainly Italy and Spain are looking for. I think that the European policymakers are very aware that if they do not deliver anything, they're going to see horrible market reaction on Thursday,
Order
Friday and
submitted.
beyond.
Order
so
submitted.
It's not going to be full
Order
debt
filled.
utilization, but
Order
maybe an
filled.
increased fund, which should help some of those peripheral economies. And remember, I think
Order
this is a step-by-step
filled.
process.
Order
At some
submitted.
point, I do believe
Order
we will
submitted.
get to a point where there is full debt mutualization. But these things don't come about within
Order
a month
filled.
or just a few
Order
weeks.
filled.
It's a kind of a multi-year process sometimes.
So when you hear things like the ECB looking for bad bank to offset loans, which could free up more money for some of the banks that are under stress, like these kind of things that we hear, do we care? Does it make them investable? Like, how do you translate that into a thesis?
I think you do have to care because it does change the story. I mean, European financials are very cheap. In some ways, it makes sense given that you've got all these bad loan problems in Europe. And it's really a story that we've known about for a decade. We've been talking about that the European banking system looks a lot less healthy than the US one. But if you're going to have the ECB coming in and setting up a separate area just for bad loans, that may be changing the game in terms of valuation. So I think it is something that you need to be aware of. But again, keep in mind that there are a lot of factors which are going to be weighing on European banking sector going forward. And I wonder how much the ECB can really help given the kind of magnitude of problem that we're looking at.
Totally right. In terms of currencies, just to get your quick take on the dollar here, I was reading that you have long positions in euro dollar are actually building, but euro dollar cannot catch a bid. Where is the next direction for the dollar that you see?
I think it's going to be stable at a very strong level. I guess I'm slightly more pessimistic about the growth outlook than maybe certainly the S&P 500 is suggesting. So as long as you have weakness from the coronavirus and other areas of the economy, that's still going to play in well for the US dollar. But given at these levels, you wonder how much further it can really go.
All right, Seema, always great to catch up with you. I really appreciate your time. Seema Shah, Principal at Global Investors. Thank you very much. Coming up on the program, it's a deeper drop and a slower climb. That's how Morgan Stanley describes what it calls, quote, the great COVID-19 recession. Chief U.S. economist Ellen Zentner joins us next. Also on a break here, United Airlines coming out. Their first quarter preliminary total revenue is about $8 billion. That's down 17%. They do say that they have cash and cash equivalents include about $2 billion in undrawn revolving credit facility. Nonetheless, they're looking at revenues down as much as 17%, the preliminary read for the first quarter. They also say that they can borrow about $4.5 billion from the U.S. Treasury Department, which we know came out with billions of dollars for all the airlines. We don't know which airlines agreed to it and what the terms were, but now we learn that United's looking at potential to borrow $4.5 billion from the Treasury market. This is Bloomberg. Morgan Stanley sees the second quarter U.S. GDP now dropping by 38% and sees the unemployment rate now rising to 15.7%. Joining me now is the woman behind the call, Ellen Zentner, Morgan Stanley chief U.S. economist. Ellen, great to chat with you. Thank you so much for joining us. How do we know that that's the worst it's
good
going to
morning,
get?
Alex.
How do you model right now? And how do you know you're not going to have to downgrade again because no one knows where this is growing?
Well, I can tell you any downgrades to the data at this point is not going to be surprising. And what's also not surprising is that with every data release, the words record decline seems to precede the numbers. And so we feel we've captured it properly with a 38% Q over Q annualized decline in the second quarter, which would be the sharpest drop into recession on record. But have we gotten it properly negative enough? Is it negative 50%? It absolutely could be. We're working off of data that we've gotten in hand so far, so we know how bad the spending was going into the second quarter because we got those March retail sales numbers. We know that more than 20 million people have lost their jobs. We think it will climb to around 25 million or so before all is said and done. And so far, we finally got all of the states participating in the non-essential business closures. So the idea is, can it get worse? And I think that's more of the important point to make here is that we're moving through the absolute worst of it now. Now, that doesn't mean the return to growth is going to be very exciting, but we're moving through the worst of it now.
I'm glad you brought that up because you were the first economist to look at 2020 as not all sunshine and roses. The first one to sort of really start talking about something that didn't look like a V-shaped recovery. What's the quality of growth in 2021? What does it look like?
So, it's a strange spot for not just economists, but everyone to be in that typically, typical cyclical factors would drive your expectation for how the economy grows out of a downturn. But this is really dictated by the virus. And so we've relied very heavily on Matthew Harrison, our biotechnology analyst, and the work he does with analysts at Johns Hopkins and his own team formulating how the virus may play out. And you've got, rolling arrangements across the country of different states pulling back on social distancing measures, non-essential business closures. And so it can look very different from state to state. It can look very different where it begins on the coast and then moves to the middle of the country. And then those work from home arrangements, that's going to be dictated not just by governors, but by the businesses. And of course, we spend a lot less when we work from home. It's going to take some time for everyone to come back physically into the office. And some of those work from home arrangements may be durable. So I think we have to temper our expectations for what growth looks like beyond just the quarter after we start to lift some of these restrictions. Right away, growth will look explosive. And why is that? Well, if you've been living in a hole and you poke your head out of that hole, that's explosive growth. But it's beyond that. What does that shape of growth look like? And it's very difficult to see the economy at full capacity again until a vaccine, which might not come until June next year.
Right, June next year. So, Ellen, I know you're not Mike Wilson, you're a U.S. equity strategist, but I keep on trying to understand why the market has already priced in literally a V within the equity market in terms of what its absolute level is versus the actual data, which, as you say, is so unclear. Is there going to be a correlation at some point between the two?
Well, I think that it's interesting because, and Mike Wilson and I were just on a call for an hour together this morning. So we speak to each other quite often. When we were in the office, we sit right next to each other. And so it is interesting because the economy often behaves very differently than markets. So, have companies been beat up enough? Have investors punished stocks enough to already capture in that things cannot get worse?
Order
so that
canceled.
It's easy to see a turn in the fundamentals that, again, that any kind of return to growth is positive. And that's something that would affect the stock market differently than, say, the economy. I think that certainly investors would be disappointed, and this is my view as an economist, if we were into that situation where we just can't seem to get much off the ground here all the way into June next year when there's a vaccine. I think that as more of the work from home arrangements come off And especially if we get therapeutic help from drugs that can at least treat COVID-19, I think that will make a difference in removing some of this crisis of confidence among households that we're going to have on the other side of this and get them out there moving and shaking again. And then in that case, that cyclical view from a stock market standpoint will be perfectly justified.
Which, to your point, there was an article in the FT, an opinion piece, basically saying, like, U.S. is going to enter an era of austerity. Like, no one's going to want to spend after this at the end of the day. What can the government really do about it at this point? I mean, if we get $300 billion, $500 billion more for a payroll protection program, if we get, a stimulus package number 4, like, is any of that actually going to be stimulative?
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's what I would call them, including the CARES Act, is a package of support. A government supporting solvency, the Fed addressing liquidity, but these are packages of support. There are elements of it, though, that can act stimulative later on. And so, again, once we're able to move around more freely, right now we're giving the rebate checks to households. We're supporting small businesses. We're extending the unemployment benefits and giving that $600 weekly check in addition. All of that is we're going to see explosive savings rate here because there's not a lot you can do with that besides put food on the table and be sure you can still pay your bills. What that means, though, is that later on as confidence returns, that is there as precautionary savings that can be drawn upon should households need it. Now, you said something interesting. Will people ever spend again, or will the savings rate just remain very high? After 2008, we were saying never again. The household will never spend again. The savings rate will never come back down. And it didn't come back down to where it was before the financial crisis. But 5 years on, when households were finished deleveraging, household consumption patterns went right back to normal. So I hesitate at this early stage to say there will be a permanent shift here. Certainly some trends will be accelerated. More people are going to deliver food to home, for instance, than before. But I hesitate to take too many liberties in saying never more will we ever be the same.
Ellen, it was so great to catch up with you. I'd love to catch up with you in a couple more weeks to see how you're looking at all the data coming out. Ellen Zentner, Morgan Stanley Chief U.S. Economist, thank you very, very much. And stay tuned. We're going to be speaking with Larry Kudlow later on in the day. He's Chief White House Economic Advisor. This is Bloomberg.
Trump administration is trying to free up cash for businesses hit hard by the coronavirus. It will allow importers and manufacturers to delay tariff payments for 90 days, this on many overseas products. But the move doesn't stop ongoing punitive tariffs. They are the centerpiece of the current U.S. trade policy. And now to a deal. It's close on the next coronavirus aid deal. President Donald Trump has joined Democratic leaders and some in his administration. They're working with the White House and Democratic leaders on a new package that would provide up to $500 billion. More money would go to the loan program for small businesses, plus funding for hospitals and testing. And we end with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He's resisting pressure to ease the coronavirus lockdown. Bloomberg has learned Mr. Johnson fears a second wave of the pandemic could hit the UK. The Prime Minister hasn't returned to work after being struck by the virus. Global News, 24 hours a day on air, not quick take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Viviana Hurtado. This is Bloomberg. Alex.
Thanks so much, Viviana. And if you're a market participant and looking at the oil price, I mean, it's down 35% today. Yeah, sure, Oslo's the session by 2%, but it's still the worst intraday loss since 1982. Bloomberg Anne-Marie Horton joins us now for more. Two parts to it. One's technical, but it's not like tomorrow everything's going to be sunshine and roses.
Yeah, absolutely not. As you say, one part is technical. You see a lot of money moving into that June contract. That's where all the volume is. But I really do think that this contract, this May contract that expires tomorrow, that is now trading at $11.80, the historic plunge, Alex, we've never seen anything like this since the data going back. That is really reflecting the physical market. If you're in this market and you're a futures trader, you have to accept that physical barrel. And the problem is there's just no room left to store it. So what this really shows is just the absolute glut we're seeing in the market and just the storage capacity that isn't there, Alex.
Well, and that really
submitted.
will shine a light
Order
too on Wednesday's
submitted.
report from the EIA in terms of how much storage here in the U.S. specifically is left.
Yeah, the Cushing storage is rapidly filling up, and that's what we know. They have a little bit of room to play with, and of course, that's the hub for the United States, and that's the pipelines to Canada, to Texas, to the Gulf, and the pipeline's already filling up. I mean, and this is what the futures picture is showing. When you dig deeper and look at the physical market, Alex, there are some parts of Texas that are trying to get rid of crude for $2. That's per barrel. That's not a gallon of gasoline you'd put in your car. That's for a barrel of crude oil. So the demand picture, this just shows absolute demand destruction. And one of the things to think about is, of course, we have these OPEC plus cuts, but they don't take effect till May 1st. For April, it looked like they were still pumping similar amounts. The oil supply war may be over, but these countries are still going for market share. And of course, when you look down the table, if you look at the contracts, I'm looking at June at $22 a barrel, July $27 a barrel. The idea is that hopefully demand will pick up, but we could be in the same situation next month if we have still on lockdowns. What was it yesterday? About 96% of passengers, that's what the downturn was for airlines. We could still be in the same picture next month and the month after if we continuously see demand destruction and lockdowns not lifted, Alex.
That's such a great point because contracts roll over every month. And also to your point, U.S. shale guys, if they're cutting production, that's not going to take effect till May either. And then we have earnings from like Halliburton, which is very much exposed to the lower 48 and onshore drilling. And they're cutting spending to a 4-year low. And that stock is still down 7-8%. It's sort of like no matter what you do, you could still get worse if you're an oil company.
Yeah, and I think one thing to watch now is seeing the serious pressure we're seeing in the United States is I'm interested to see what the Texas Railroad Commission does. They're named the Railroad Commission, but they're a regulator for the oil and gas market. It would be very unprecedented, and a lot of people don't think it's going to happen, but you're seeing numbers like this. Are they potentially going to do this pro-rationing, basically having some sort of mechanism for the state of Texas so producers would have to ratchet back? Whether or not they do that or not, what you're saying, we saw with Halliburton today, all of these companies having to cut spending, cut drilling, we're going to see shut-ins, but it'll be interesting to see if Texas actually makes that move, Alex.
Yeah, good point. Or they're just going to say they are when they're just going to have to cut regardless. All right, thanks so much, Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Horton. Coming up, ESG investing in the face of the coronavirus outbreak. It was all the talk about 3 months ago. Is it still? Are the S and the G now becoming more critical? I'll speak to Carol Leibel, Domini Impact Investments CEO. This is Bloomberg. Welcome to Bloomberg Daybreak. I'm Alex Steele. Happy Monday, except if you were long crude, then it's a really, really bad Monday. You have S&P futures they're off by about 1-2%. It's brutal over in Europe. It's turning out to be a risk-off day here in the U.S. And I already mentioned the why. So if you switch up the board, you can see it. WTI now trading at $11.68. That is a contract rollover issue, but it is a record spread between this month's contract rolling over and the next one, all reflective of the lack of demand and oversupply in the market. That's really a fundamental thing, and that's not going to go away tomorrow once the June contract starts trading. All of that leading to a stronger dollar. You're also seeing a sell-off in most markets over in Europe, with the exception of U.S. Treasuries, still getting some of that safe haven buying as money flows into the dollar and flows into the Treasury market. I do want to point out the Chicago Fed National Activity Index falls about 4.19. That's worse than estimated as the data just comes out. We know it's going to be bad. The how bad, though, continues to be the question for the markets. So where do you want to go for any kind of safety? Well, interestingly enough, ESG ETFs are actually outperforming the S&P in this pandemic rout. BlackRock, for example, found a few bright spots in their first quarter, and one of them was long-term net outflows, about $19 billion, while its ESG fund saw $10 billion in inflows. Joining me now is Carol Leibel, Domini Impact Investments CEO. Carol has $718 million in assets under management in the Domini Impact International Equity Fund. The fund has also outpaced the S&P from the start of the decline on February 19th all the way through April 16th. Carol, you also have decades of experience within the impact space, so it's really good to catch up with you today. ESG was all the talk as of December. How much do people still care about it?
Good morning, Alex. Thanks for having me. So, as you point out, we have seen virtually, we could call it a stampede into the field, both at the investor level interest, but also from the conventional asset manager side, mutual funds, ETFs, et cetera.
Order canceled.
And if you look at some of the statistics, according to US SIP, which is the Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investing, ESG assets grew from $8.7 trillion at the start of 2016 to $12 trillion at the start of 2018. So there, we were seeing an increase of 38%, which represented at that point 1 in $4 of professionally managed funds in the U.S. So, we saw great momentum underway already, and I think with these crises that we face today, we're going to continue to see that interest. And we were pleased to see positive inflows into our funds as well in the first quarter of this year.
So, Carol, I wonder, at the end of last year, I felt like the conversation was very much revolving more around the E in the ESG, environmental concerns, how companies are cutting their carbon emissions, steps that they're taking for that, et cetera. Now, the feeling to me is that it's more about the S and the G, the social and the governance, as in what kind of CEOs and board members are taking pay cuts? Are they furloughing or laying off workers? How are they treating their workers in this time of the virus? Can you give me some perspective on that?
Sure. So I think historically we've seen investors are very interested in the environmental side. And I don't think that we're going to see a change with that, although there is a lot of focus right now of corporations' response to, as you say, the social aspect of this crisis. We also believe that this is going to be an indicator and really some big environmental lessons to be taken away from this as well. So, firstly, if you think about the disease itself, like most emerging diseases, this likely arose partially as a result of deforestation. So the risk of these novel viruses are just one example of the huge risks that are presented by this continued pattern of environmental degradation and biodiversity loss. So really protecting those natural ecosystems is going to be vital to all businesses, and really going beyond just mitigating deforestation, but in fact restoring and protecting them. But I think the other important thing that we're going to take away from this is that there are a lot of parallels to climate change. So there's actually a new term that has been coined. We've all, I think, are familiar with the term black swans, but now there's a new term called gray rhinos, which is that we've all been warned. We see what's coming at us and the severe effects that we're likely to experience. But most people are in a situation or choosing to ignore those. So I think this, having lived through this crisis, we can learn that the cost of dealing with a systemic breakdown once it gets started is much higher than preparing for it in advance. But that's not to say, I mean, I think there is a lot of response, as you point out, also on the social side in response to the virus as well, both in terms of the types of companies we invest in, but also using our voice as investors to create that positive change that we need.
The question before was that if we see all these inflows into ESG products, how do they actually perform in a downturn? Can you give me some perspective on just that? How they performed, what areas of ESG maybe perform better than others, and what's a good benchmark to use?
Sure. So our Domini Impact Equity Fund, which I'm a portfolio manager on, has held up really quite well through the crisis relative to the overall market. I think it's important to point out, bear in mind, returns are still negative, but having the ability to, save some of that capital and be less negative than the overall market is an important thing. And we find that both in the short term, since the crisis began to unfold, say after the market peak in February 19th through today, but also over the past year. And some of the things that have helped, so you pointed out our environmental concerns as well as our social and environmental. There, if you look at our funds, we've restricted investments in the GICS energy sector. So when you have a day like today where you see oil prices plummeting, that is actually good for the performance of our funds. As we divested from that, really dating back to late 2018 to address both the financial risks, but also those moral risks that are related to climate change. The other things that help is, we do tend to be focused on products that add value, not only to the planet, but also to people. So our equity funds are focused on providing those essential products and services such as diagnostics or healthcare equipment. Certainly telehealth services, so Teladoc Health has been one of our strongest performers in this downturn. But also biotech and pharma companies that are working to develop vaccines and potential treatments for the coronavirus. And then I think, another thing to point out is there are other sectors that can be helpful as well. So if you think about responsible financial institutions that are working to ensure that small businesses have access to the capital they need to get through this economic downturn. I think the other point
really
that's very important in that ESG space is to use your voice. The other point I think that's important is not just what's in your portfolio, but how you behave with those companies as owners. So using our voice as investors is important. We drafted a statement calling on the business community to take urgent action to mitigate the worst outcomes of this crisis. And there we collaborated with other investors. We work closely with the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, but also New York City Comptroller's Office. We have more than 300 investors representing over $8 trillion that are signed on to a statement to the business community with 5 recommendations that we believe can help mitigate some of the worst of the crisis. So that we'll approach each of the companies in our portfolio and work with them to strategically engage on how they may help to address some of those recommendations.
All right, Carol, we're going to have to leave it there, but I really appreciate this perspective. Carol Leibel of Domini Impact Investments, thanks very much. And coming up on the program, it's a retail freeze. Stores shut their doors due to the pandemic. I'm going to speak exclusively with the CEO of parent company of Calvin Klein and Tommy Hilfiger brands, Manny Tiricho of PVH will join me next in today's Bottom Line. Plus, if you have a Bloomberg terminal, go ahead and look at GTV Go. Check out all the charts we're using throughout the program. GTV Go. This is Bloomberg.
Order canceled. Order canceled.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak. I'm Vivian Hurtado, and you're looking at the principal room. Coming up later today on Bloomberg Markets, Ed Hyman, Evercore ISI chairman. This is Bloomberg Daybreak. I'm Vivian Hurtado with your Bloomberg Business Flash. We begin with United Airlines. It says it expects to get $5 billion from the government's payroll support plan, and it could use the help.
Order
United
submitted.
saying
Order
it will cut
submitted.
90% of its capacity in May, and it's expecting a similar cutback in June. Now to burger chain Shake Shack. It will return its entire $10 million loan from the U.S. government. The loans are designed for small businesses hurt by the coronavirus. Last year, Shake Shack had sales of $595 million. Bloomberg has learned more than a dozen publicly traded companies with revenue topping $100 million received these loans. And we end with casino operator Wynn Resorts. It's calling for parts of the Nevada economy to start reopening in May. CEO Matt Maddox saying the Las Vegas Strip should be opened in the middle or the end of the month. Wynn has released a 23-page proposal on how it'll keep casinos, hotel rooms, and guests safe. I'm Vivian Hurtado, and that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Alex.
All right, time now for Bottom Line. We're going to look at some sectors and companies worth watching this morning. And today our focus is on retail. Retail sales seeing a painful collapse in March, only going to get worse. And joining me now is Manny Tiricho. Sorry, Manny, I'm sorry about that. PVH chairman and CEO. PVH owns three titans of the apparel industry, including Calvin Klein, Tommy Hilfiger, and Heritage Brands. Manny, so excited to chat with you. I just want to get perspective from you of how you manage businesses when we just have no clarity right now.
Well, I think right now there's two big issues, and both center on liquidity. One is managing expenses as best as you possibly can.
Order canceled. Order canceled.
We've put a
Order
number of
submitted.
initiatives
Order submitted.
together around discretionary spending, payroll, and salary reductions where our executive teams have cut back on salary. The other area is the balance sheet, particularly inventory. And that's really tricky at this point in time because you have to anticipate when the stores are going to reopen, how much time you're going to have left in the spring-summer season to sell fashion apparel as we go through the next few months, depending when we reopen, both here in North America and in Europe, which represents about 80% of our business. And then finally, trying to figure out what to buy for fall and holiday with the concerns around a reoccurrence of the virus. So it's really a tricky time right now, and it's putting a lot of pressure on all retail, particularly apparel and accessories.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, you're looking at Macy's looking at rescue financing. Some reports say that Nordstrom's could be close to bankruptcy. You guys just raised some money. You agreed to a $275 million revolving credit line. You actually drew from your current credit facility as well. Can you just tie all this in for me, especially executive and board comp being cut? How much liquidity do you have for how long? Like, how long does this last you for?
Well, we are fortunate, given our balance sheet and how we're structured, our cash position. We're well over $1.5 billion in available cash with a very strong balance sheet. The add-ons that we have done and some that we are considering is more or less add-ons to existing borrowing bases. So our balance sheet is unsecured at this point. All of our debt. So we have a great deal of flexibility, and I think we have more than enough cash to get us through this crisis. But I think we're in the minority when you really get down to it and start thinking about where other retailers are, and they've had to take assets and pledge them, use them as security, and they've also just been in a situation where having to go out and potentially raise equity at very steep prices right now.
So do you expect, I mean, what do you think plays out in the industry? Like, are we looking at bankruptcies? Are there going to be mergers? Like, is it Chapter 7, Chapter 11? Like, what do you see in the market?
Look, I think retail was going through, especially apparel and accessory retail, was going through a consolidation to begin with. And when I would talk about it, I would talk about a 5 to 6 year trend that we would see, anywhere from 20 to 30% of the stores in the United States closed over a period of time. When you look at the U.S. retail market, we're just overstored compared to every other region in the world. On top of that now, as the online component has become a greater piece of the business, that's putting pressure on it. This virus pandemic has only accelerated that, and I would expect over the next 2 to 3 years, we will see store closures. We'll see M&A where weaker retailers with strong real estate will be acquired, and then finally, unfortunately, I think we will see bankruptcies and restructurings as we go forward.
And then you mentioned specifically you're looking at inventory. So to that point, when you think about reopening stores, how do you think about that? Not from a demand perspective, but how do you protect the workers? Do you structure how many people are going to be coming into the stores? Do you have to renovate the stores? What are you thinking about?
Well, I think there's going to require some investment in stores to protect the workers, screens that we're putting up, plexiglass that we're putting up to protect the workers between themselves and the consumers, especially at the cash wrap. A number of issues around significantly more cleaning that will go on constantly as we go forward. Our stores aren't big box retail stores that, 50 or 60,000 square foot stores. About half of our business is retail, and I'd say our average store is about 8,000 square feet. So give you a typical specialty store that you would see in a high street or in a mall-based retailer. And I think it does require a significant amount of investment there, cleaning, protecting the workers with masks and protective gear. We're actually looking at some protective gear that'll be since we're a fashion retail, it'll be a little bit more fashionable than just throwing on some kind of hospital gown. So we're working on all those things as we go forward, but in order to protect our employees and to protect the consumers when they're shopping in our stores. It's a brave new world when it comes to all of that.
No kidding. And so I wondered if you could give me some perspective into your margins, because as you said, you're going to have to shell out money to do that for your stores. At the same time, managing inventory, 6-7 months out, I can't imagine how you do that and what you do with the inventory that's kind of left in your stores now and how much you've discounted to get it out the door. Can you give me a feel for how you're looking at it?
Yeah, we're planning internally very conservatively on the margin line. We're anticipating that when stores do reopen, it's not going to be a V-shaped recovery. That's not what we are seeing in Asia. We're seeing a gradual recovery throughout our business in Asia and China. Business week over week keeps getting better, but we're still running overall somewhat negative to where we were this time last year. So it's not like it comes back and takes off. I think the consumer has to get comfortable about going back out again, has to get comfortable about shopping again in that environment. And that takes a little bit of time as that works forward. And I think, as you said, I think there's going to be plenty of inventory. And if you think about the spring-summer season, if you want to call it a 26-week season, we're in the process here in North America of losing anywhere from 8 to 12 weeks of sales on them, and that would be somewhat optimistic, assuming we're going to open up in May, early June, and we've lost 8 to 12 weeks of some of the best selling when you think about the Easter selling season as you're going into Easter, Mother's Day, which clearly we're going to miss a big part of that. And then even as we go into Father's Day, we're going to miss a big part of that as well. So it's going to be a situation where there's plenty of inventory and people are going to be looking to turn that inventory into cash. So we're anticipating that it's going to be very promotional and with significant discounts. But the key is to clean the inventory out and move forward. I think when you look at fiscal 2020, it's really not about earnings. It's about liquidity and cash flow.
Order filled.
So that's about liquidity, cash flow. When does it become about earnings? Is that like a 2021 or even 2022 story at this point for you?
Well, I think it really depends how, a lot of that is out of our control. It's really going to depend how much, is there therapeutic response to the virus where if you get it, let's say in the third or fourth quarter, there'll be drugs that will make just about everyone get better. I think that would be a game changer as we move forward. Obviously, a vaccine in 2021. So we're looking at the fourth quarter as the first time, fourth quarter of 2020, that we have an opportunity to actually do something that would be closer to a normal selling season for us. So as we get into that October, November time frame, we would hope that we would start to see some recovery there and that margins could be something that would be closer to normal as we move forward.
Manny, thanks so much for your candor. I really, really appreciate it. Manny Tirico of PVH, thanks a lot. And for more on how CEOs are navigating the pandemic and how they're planning, join us for Leadership Live with David Rubenstein for an exclusive interview with Marriott's CEO. That's coming up today at 3 p.m. here in New York. And coming up on the program, what do you do with oil at $11 a barrel? We'll break that down, how much downside's actually left. We'll check it out in today's Technically Speaking. This is Bloomberg.
Order submitted. Order submitted.
All right, time for Technically Speaking. Mike McGlone, Bloomberg Intelligence commodity strategist, joins me now. All eyes, Mike, on oil, trying to catch the low here. What do you see?
Well, the first thing is the big picture. Oil's near the lowest level ever for futures. That was 1063 in 1986. And this is the front contract. But the big picture is it's going down with bond yields. It's probably going to stay there for a long time. This is the long slog. But in the shorter term, we can go to the next chart that shows it's really a contango issue with expiring contract, which stops trading tomorrow.
So then, but like tomorrow, we're not going to go back up to 25, right?
Order canceled.
How do we have to think
canceled.
About it?
Order submitted.
That's one way to look
Order
at it. So
submitted.
the front contract goes to the cash, and the cash is right around 11 at the moment. But as of tomorrow, when that May goes off the board, it's going to go to June. June right now is $22, almost double the price. So that's where it's going to go, and that's what we show in the next chart. Is that
leave it there.
Order filled. Order submitted. Order submitted. Order filled. Order submitted. Order submitted.
From New York City for our audience worldwide, good morning, good morning. The countdown to the open starts right now, 30 minutes away from the opening bell and following the first back-to-back weekly gains on the S&P 500. Going back to the middle of February, we start this Monday morning negative. Here's the price action on equity futures on the S&P 500. We are down 54 points and negative 1.89%. A snoozer in the bond market. Yields unchanged through most of this morning. The focus on the commodity markets. What you will see on a lot of boards is the May contract. WTI aggressively lower at $11.33. I can tell you 5-6 times the volume is going through the June contract now. So let me give you a flavour of the June contract, because that's going to be a little bit more instructive for you for the week ahead. $22 a barrel on June, and still aggressively lower on the session. We'll get to that a little bit more a little bit later on the programme. I want to start with some good news, away from the markets and focus on policy just a little bit more. It looks like the President of the United States, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, and the Democrats have settled some of the differences, and we may well get another $500 billion of aid, maybe today, but potentially later this week. That's the good news. A little bit of improvement there is something we all need. Elsewhere, quite clearly making some advancements, talking about reopening the economy as well. Also good news and a conversation that we can have a little bit later in the programme with Larry Kudlow. Another thing that we have heard from the administration is that they are delaying some tariff payments. I emphasise some, for 90 days. That'll be a conversation for the White House a little bit later. So look out for the interview that I'll be having with the National Economic Council Director at 10:10 Eastern, both on Bloomberg TV and on Bloomberg Radio. So the day ahead dictated not just by what's happening in the oil market, but also what's happening down in Washington, D.C. So let's wrap it all together and catch up with Bloomberg's Mike McKee. Good morning to you, Mike.
Good morning to you, John. Let's start with the tariffs, because that came out last night. The administration giving half a loaf, maybe a third of a loaf on tariffs. They will allow companies to defer for 90 days tariff payments on imported goods. Now, this does not apply to anti-dumping or countervailing duties or Trump's punitive tariffs, which means it doesn't apply to Chinese-made goods, it doesn't apply to the steel and aluminum tariffs, and it doesn't apply to tariffs tied to enforcement actions like the penalties against Airbus. To qualify, importers have to demonstrate significant financial hardship and that they were ordered to close down partially or fully by a government agency. So this might help some companies with cash flow. That's what the Treasury Secretary said. Won't do anything for demand longer term, but maybe helps companies in the short run. We might also mention, as long as we're talking about this, the Chinese trade deal. Bloomberg Economics has checked into that. They're not buying anything near what they said they would buy. So that's something that's hanging out there as well in the relationship between the two. In Washington, they are saying Godot is about to arrive, or at least they may have a package deal sometime today. Reportedly includes the initial plan for another $250 billion in Paycheck Protection Plan funding. Also, another $65 billion for economic injury disaster loans. Remember, Paycheck Protection is to keep people on the payrolls. This other EIDL loans would be to keep the lights on, make rent payments, things like that. $65 billion for the SBA's disaster fund, money for hospitals, and money for testing. Hospitals, scientific experts, governors, just about everybody says there are not enough tests. We can't reopen the country, so they want to get more funding for that. The hope is the Senate may vote today or tomorrow by unanimous consent. They're in session now. They could just walk in and one member could say everybody, and that'll vote. The House, a bigger problem. They're working on an elaborate plan, John, to vote by proxy. If you don't want to come in, you can tell somebody who is here how you would vote, and they would vote for you. They want to avoid a situation like the last stimulus bill where Kentucky Representative Thomas Massey forced everybody to fly back to Washington for the vote. So this could take until Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday before the House can get a vote together. But by the end of the week, the belief in Washington is we will have phase 3.5 done.
I think the hope on Wall Street is that happens as well. Mike, you and I have talked about this so many times over the last several months, that perfection is the enemy of the good, and we needed to move quickly. And when you move quickly, you have to accept an uncomfortable downside, and that's programs like the small business program will be leveraged by people who shouldn't be using it. Let's be clear about that. If you're a large public company with 8,000 employees, this program was not designed for you. Shake Shack reportedly got access to funds, Mike. They've now said they will give those funds back. When you top it up, you get another chance just to tweak the rules a little bit to make sure this money goes exactly to where it's supposed to go.
Order filled.
When they top it up later this week, Mike, are they going to tweak the rules a little bit?
Reportedly, that's in the bill. There will be money set aside for minorities, for women-owned enterprises, for specific areas, and possibly even some caps on some of the lending so that big companies don't get... They weren't supposed to, but they applied for their subsidiaries and managed to get that through. The hope is that some new rules tweaks will keep that from happening.
And some of them embarrassed enough to return the money as well. So maybe that's good news this morning too. Mike, great to catch up with you. Stay close. We'll catch up with you a little bit later. Bloomberg's Michael McKee on the latest. So let's get to the investor conversation, shall we? Oil plunging. High yield has been stable over the last couple of weeks. Stable why? Because the Federal Reserve is in the mix in a big way. Here's a quote from Jefferies from the weekend research saying the following. The Fed is in danger of making the skill set of investors in credit redundant if the game only becomes front-running the next area of debt that the Fed is going to buy. That quote from Jefferies. Let's bring in our first guest, shall we? Lale Topcholu of J.O. Hambro. Lale, great to catch up with you because I know over the last 2 weeks you've pushed back on the interpretation or misinterpretation of what the Federal Reserve has done by many market participants. Can you give us some clarity there?
Sure. Good morning, John. I think when I read simply the term sheets and I look at the pricing and the way how they have been very thoughtful about what assets they buy, at what price they buy, I don't think they're bailing out the market. I think they are certainly trying to avoid rapid fire sales and broad liquidation of all asset classes, which is basically what we saw in that March period. But they're not bailing anybody out. Yes, high-yield ETFs made it, but it's lower in priority, and they specifically state that they're not going to buy it if things are at a premium. But back in March, all these ETFs were trading at substantial discounts because there was massive liquidation.
Order
so
submitted.
I disagree
Order
with the market.
submitted.
I think they've been
Order
a lot
submitted.
more thoughtful and surgical about the programs.
So if you disagree, if that's your distinction, Lale, what does that mean for how you view markets? What's mispriced?
Order filled. Order submitted. Order submitted.
For us, the only place that we so far we think there's value left is that short end investment grade
Order filled.
investment grade
Order
paper.
submitted.
There are
Order
still companies
submitted.
that are shut out of the commercial paper facility, especially if you're a foreign issuer. As you would expect, you don't have access to the facilities. If you're banks, you don't have access to the facilities. And there's still some value left there, but it's increasingly hard because as I guess Jefferies pointed out, the market is playing the game of what's next in the assets, who's going to get bailed out, and they're chasing these assets. But look, we have no clarity on the economic outlook. It's like asking somebody to jump over a hurdle, but you don't tell them how deep it is and whether they're going to fall and break their neck. I think the market has gone way ahead of itself.
So let's talk about what that means for equity, because I know you have to manage a hybrid of securities here, Lale, not just on the credit side, but also on the equity side. I've spoken to many people who still want to participate. Maybe they felt uncomfortable over the last couple of weeks, but they're still participating. What have you been doing on the equity side?
We have participated, but we've been extremely select, trying to pick the winners. Because at the end of the day, I think there are actually some companies that are quite at the epicenter of this economic shutdown, where the stock prices have down, 40%, 50%, where we think they have a strong balance sheet, and they're actually going to be consolidators at the exit point. So that doesn't mean 40% can't go down another 10, 20%, but we feel confident about their balance sheet. This, for us, it's all have been about thinking about balance sheet leverage and whether you have cash flow to make it to the other end, because cash is king regardless of what everybody else says.
Lale, it's the haves and haves not. And what I read between the lines with you is you think the big will get much bigger, that this will be a market share game and it will take place very quickly as we come out the other side. Is that what you're positioning for on the equity side?
That's certainly one of the themes, because I think if you think back before this crisis, there was a lot of desire to do M&A, but the multiples were, the buyers and the sellers' multiples were wide apart. Well, when you go into a crisis, those multiples get closer, right? You have more of a chance to agree on a price. And we do think the bigger names are going to get bigger, and they're certainly going to gain market share. That's definitely a theme in our portfolios.
So, Lale, this was the Morgan Stanley take from the weekend research, and I'll bring it to my audience right now and just read out a little snippet about the potential for downside risk here. And it says the following, quote, keep in mind that the highest quality companies tend to have the highest expectations, which makes their stocks potentially more vulnerable to the bad micro news we expect for most companies. What do you say back to that, Lali, that maybe there's a bit more downside risk because these are the companies, the big ones with the strong balance sheets that are meant to be the high-quality names, they're the ones that have already done well?
It's possible. So there's 2 points to it. One is obviously similar to what we have seen, both in the credit and the equity. You're seeing it where people are hiding out in the defensive, right? That's exactly the point. But on the other side, a name that's also cheap on a valuation basis, it can also go down. It can also have its value, and we've also seen that. So, I think there's a truth to that statement, but I think there's also a pushback to that statement.
Order canceled.
So,
Order canceled.
I think
Order
you just
canceled.
pick your
Order
winners
submitted.
winners
Order
very
filled.
carefully.
Order
Can
submitted.
it go down another
Order
10,
submitted.
20%?
Order
Absolutely.
submitted.
But
Order
also something you
canceled.
bought that's
Order
down
canceled.
60% can
Order
also go down
submitted.
another 50%.
Order submitted.
Lali, always great to get your thoughts on a programme. I hope you and yours are doing well. The whole of the family. Lali Topcholu there of J.O. Hambro. A lot to get through on this programme. In just a moment, we'll catch up with Steve Englander of Standard Chartered. Then later, Amrita Sen of Energy Aspects on a huge crude move over the last several weeks. And then a little bit later this morning, Larry Kudlow from the White House on the administration's response from New York with futures lower. This is Bloomberg TV.
Order filled. Order submitted. Order submitted. Order filled. Order submitted. Order submitted. Order filled. Order submitted. Order submitted. Order filled. Order submitted. Order filled. Order submitted. Order submitted. Order submitted. Order filled. Order filled.
At this point, I don't think we can be that concerned about those kind of moral hazards. I really think we have to really look at this is a hugely impactful and negatively impactful shock. And we have to do all we can to make sure that we're not doing permanent damage to the underlying fundamentals of the economy.
Loretta Mester there, the Federal Reserve Bank
Order
of Cleveland
submitted.
president,
Order
weighing in on the
submitted.
latest moves from the central bank. Now is not a time to worry about these moral hazards. Some words that she mentioned this last Friday that stirred a little bit of controversy from many of you in our audience. Many investors, though, not thinking about what the Fed should and shouldn't do. As we often debate, it's about what they will and won't do. And this is what Rick Reeder of BlackRock had to say last week. We will follow the Fed and other DM central banks by purchasing what they're purchasing and assets that
Order
rhyme
canceled.
with those.
Order
To continue
canceled.
the conversation,
Order
let's bring in
canceled.
Steve Englander
Order
of
submitted.
Standard Chartered,
Order
shall we?
filled.
Steve, in
Order
your mind,
submitted.
let's just get this
Order
one out of the way.
submitted.
Is the Fed
Order
doing the right
submitted.
thing? think we've got some problems there with Steve Englander on my side. Steve Englander of Standard Chartered. I can't quite hear him, and I imagine that maybe you can't hear him either. So here's what we're going to do. We'll reset the program. We'll come back. We'll talk about these huge moves in the commodity market, draw a distinction between what is happening with the May contract and the June contract as well, and why there's such a wide spread. Bear in mind, what you are seeing more broadly in the futures curve in the oil market is
Order
what you
filled.
consider
Order
super
submitted.
contango.
Order
Super
submitted.
contango just means the longer dated crude prices are a lot higher
Order
than the
filled.
shorter
Order
dated crude
submitted.
prices. So we'll
Order
get into that
submitted.
distinction in just a moment. And Rita Sen of Energy Aspects will be joining us. Ahead of all of that, around about 15 minutes away from the opening bell in New York City, here is your price action. Equity futures lower by 2% on the S&P 500. We are down by 57 points. A big week ahead, some Netflix earnings after the close tomorrow, and PMI day on Thursday. Why do the PMIs matter? It's about the depth of the slowdown in the month of April. We get a preliminary read on the continent, in Europe and in the United States as well. All of that still to come from New York this morning. Good morning. This is Bloomberg TV.
Order filled. Order submitted. Order submitted. Order filled. Order submitted. Order submitted. Order filled. Order submitted. Order submitted.
Let's get you some morning calls, shall we, and start off the morning the right way by getting you a view on Wall Street ahead of the opening bell. 12 minutes away. Your first morning call this morning coming from BMO, downgrading Gilead to market perform with a $79 price target. The analyst saying there's no longer a favorable risk-reward profile given the continued uncertainty around the coronavirus drug. Next up, UBS downgrading Disney to neutral with a $114 price target. The analyst expecting the coronavirus pandemic to impair profitability for a long period of time. And finally, Bank of America upgrading Phillips 66 to a buy with a 120 price target. The analyst citing the refiner's diversified earnings, strong balance sheet and attractive valuation. Joining me now, I'm pleased to say, is Amrita Sen, Energy Aspects Chief Oil Analyst, to do a little bit of a clinic on what on earth is going on in this commodity market. Amrita, fantastic to catch up with you. Let's just make things clear. We have a broader audience in moments like this. Whenever we have stress, it's not just about the sophisticated core of a program like this. So Amrita, talk to me about it, the distinction between what is happening with the May contract and what is happening with the June contract in the futures market this morning.
And for a wide audience, okay, I'm going to try my best. So basically, WTI this morning has collapsed. It's barely at $11 per barrel, but it is going to go off the board imminently. So in some ways, I'm not saying this is not the right price.
However, there are very specific factors affecting WTI right now. Cushing, the delivery point, is set to be full in May, and that's what this contract is reflecting to some extent. But also, retail investors have been piling into this ETF called USO. And what happens is that obviously before expiry, they have to sell this contract and move over to the next contract. So that puts additional pressure. We saw the same thing in 2008, if you remember. The WTI contango widened out to $8 for 3 consecutive months. We're going to get the same thing again ahead of expiry when these retail investors are forced effectively to get out of this contract. That's why the contango in WTI is over $10 right now at the front. But again, it doesn't take away from the fact that the oil market is extremely oversupplied right now. The risk of hitting tank top is very, very high globally. But Cushing, we are going to hit tank top in May.
Yeah, and I think this is the key point, Amrita. Quite clearly for the market, all the volumes going through the June contract. I think we've got 7 times the volume just looking at the contract table on the Bloomberg. June contract at $21.76. So let's play around with that just a little bit, Amrita. Clearly, we are testing capacity constraints in the United States of America. What I'm trying to understand, just looking at the oil market more broadly, is that what we need to get more bullish further down the road? We need to take out supply and take out capacity and stomach a sharp move lower in the near term to get stability in the long term. Is that how we should think about this, Amrita?
Yeah, I think you're right about how you're thinking about it, but I would caution about getting bullish long term as to how you define that long term. There is no doubt about the fact, and we released a note just an hour or so, 2 hours ago, about this very issue, that come 2021, late 21 into 22, there will be a huge deficit in the oil market. The amount of supplies you're losing, the risk of permanent damage to reservoirs. I mean, WCS prices where they are, a lot of Canadian mines are shutting down as well. US, you're going to shut in a lot of production, some of which will struggle to come back. We potentially face the same problems in Russia. And you are just going to have no investment. There will be a huge, huge shortfall in supplies at that point. However, if people think that just by going lower right now, you can start to get bullish at the back end of this year. So, for instance, DEC 20 contracts, we think that's too soon, simply because we just don't know what the demand recovery trajectory is going to look like. Either way, even if it's better than what we are expecting, we have to remember the unemployment that's being created in the global economy is going to weigh on that recovery. That's the only caution. I completely agree with your overall notion. It's just about timing it.
Amrita, help me understand what it would take to bring us back into balance. On the supply side, they've pledged to drop by 10 million barrels a day. On the demand side, what are we looking at here? A collapse of 20 million in the second quarter?
In the second quarter, our numbers are even higher. I mean, the April numbers are more like 27 million barrels per day year on year. And Q2 overall is going to be over 15 million barrels per day. So this is where the recovery question comes in, because there are some governments starting to talk about reopening, but at what pace? And even if governments mandate it, will people be comfortable moving around? I mean, airline industries and jet demand is going to recover in months, if not years, back to pre-COVID levels, because it is going to take a very, very long time to normalize. Manufacturing can start up earlier. So we just need to be careful, again, about the rebalancing. Demand is going to be weak, but what's going to happen once you fill storage, is that supplies have to come off immediately and very quickly, because once storage is full, demand has to equate supply from the very next moment. So the supply shortfalls are only just beginning to happen, and it's only going to get worse from here.
Amrita, you touched on this a little bit earlier in the interview, and I think it's important just to emphasize, to draw a distinction between cutting supply and taking out future capacity. What's the bigger issue for you just in terms of rebalancing this market in the medium to longer term?
The biggest issue, again, I would say is going to be the trajectory of demand recovery, but assuming there will be a vaccine and we do go back to pre-COVID levels, however, or whatever the time frame is, there will be, and I really do worry about a potential price spike in the making in a couple of years' time. Really, it is only going to be OPEC and potentially some other non-OPEC members, maybe Russia, in a few years' time, that can supply the market, because without private equity and investment in shale, U.S. production growth is just going to be a shadow of its former self, if it grows at all. And I think that's going to be the 2 million barrels per day swing that's going to surprise the market. And I think that's the real risk right now, that we are setting ourselves up in the medium term for a real spike.
Amrita Sen of Energy Aspects on the oil market. Amrita, hope you and yours and the whole of the team are doing well over at Energy Aspects. Great to catch up with you this morning. Huge attention on the crude market, and for good reason as well. We'll continue to touch on it through the day right here on Bloomberg TV and, of course, on Bloomberg Radio. As we count you down to the opening bell 5 minutes away, let's get you some price action and begin with equities. We did have, finally, a second week of gains, back-to-back weekly gains on the S&P 500 for the first time going all the way back to the middle of February. Going into the opening bell, we start off this week with a bit of risk aversion. We're down 50 points on the S&P 500 and negative 1.74%. As you might expect through the morning in the FX market, underperforming the commodity currencies, the likes of Canada, Norway in the mix off the back of a big drop in crude prices. Whether you're looking at May or June, whatever you look at the curve. It is brutal in the oil market. Next up on this program, he got a lot of attention the last time he came on. Dan Suzuki of Richard Bernstein with a reality check for the bulls out there. That's next from New York. This is Bloomberg.
Order submitted. Order submitted. Order filled. Order submitted. Order submitted. Order filled.
25 seconds away from the opening bell in New York City this morning. Good morning to you all. Here is your price action going into the open. This Monday morning, we bounce off the lows. We're still negative by 47 points on the S&P 500, down by 1.6%. If you switch up the board across asset field in the bond market, yields come down 2 basis points, reflecting just some mild risk aversion on the morning. Your yield 0.62% on a US 10-year. We've talked about the underperformance in the commodity currencies. It continues in the G10 space. The commodity market is where the attention is. Look, whether you look at May or June, the story is really quite simple. Hardly anyone wants to take physical delivery of crude because not many people are there to consume it, and we're running out of places to store it in the United States. That is a snapshot as to why crude, WTI, is aggressively lower compared to what is happening with the Brent contract on the international basis. We can talk about this all day. Let's get to the market desk, shall we, and catch up with Abigail Doolittle to get you some movers this Monday morning.
Well, John, riding on the back of that top story on oil down aggressively, as you mentioned, whether you're looking at the May contract or the June contract, we have the energy complex getting crushed, not surprisingly, in sympathy with that huge plunge. Take a look at some of the movers there. ExxonMobil, major oil company, now down sharply this year. Down 6% today. Halliburton, they reported earnings down even more. Investors not liking the fact that they slashed spending to a 4-year low. You were mentioning the physical delivery issue, though, as demand simply dries up. There is one bright spot within the energy complex. Take a look at DHT Holdings. That is an oil tanker, an offshore oil tanker. Their capacity is in demand given that situation around plunging demand and needing to put oil somewhere. Turning to other movers, we do have Delta Airlines trading lower. They may shed 100,000 jobs this fall. Layoffs limits end on September 30th. That has to do with that bailout package. It's pretty amazing, John. Daily U.S. passengers down about 92% right now year over year. Boeing under pressure once again. They've received another 737 cancellation. A bright spot, though, once again in the biotech space, a smaller cap Exelixis. They are higher on positive results on their kidney cancer drug, one done in conjunction with Bristol Myers Squibb, but a risk-off tone mainly for stocks this morning, John.
Abigail, thank you. Abigail Doolittle from the market desk with the latest. Around about 2 minutes into the session here in New York. Here's your price action. The S&P 500 coming in 1.5% on the S&P. On the Nasdaq, we're down by 0.9%. The team at Bloomberg always does a fantastic job of surveying the street, getting together and going across all the different strategists on Wall Street, whether it's equity, fixed income, commodities or currencies, and gauging what they're looking for on a monthly basis for the road ahead. We do that with equities as well, of course. And on the S&P 500, our colleague Elena Popina went out there and put all the numbers together.